They were ready to shoot, but one man spoke, a truth that turned the entire town upside down. Noon in San Diablo was hot and dusty like everything else in this god-forsaken stretch of dirt. A cowboy named Grayson stood on Main Street, hand hovering over his holster, facing a bandit named Masons, whose name was long overdue for a tombstone. But instead of gunfire, the town heard a hostage's shout from behind a barrel, and his words turned everything upside down. Stick around to find out what he said and how it shook San Diablo to its core. Hey listener, how's it going? Where are you tuning in from? San Diablo choked under a scorching sun, dust kicked up by a lazy wind settling on the boots of onlookers crowding Main Street. Grayson, a tall cowboy in a faded hat, stood by the saloon, squinting into the glare, his fingers resting an inch from his revolver. Across the way, by the old barn, Masons, a bandit with a crooked grin and a scar splitting his brow, shifted from foot to foot, as if hoping the heat would do his dirty work for him. The crowd, a dozen farmers, a couple of traders, and the local seamstress clutching her basket of threads, held its breath, waiting for the first shot. Sheriff Collins, with a worn badge pinned to his vest, leaned against a post, chewing tobacco and spitting brown sludge into the dirt. His eyes, narrowed like a hawk's, tracked Grayson and Masons, but no one could guess who he was betting on today. Word around town was that Collins always knew which way the wind blew and how to end up on the winning side. Dogs whined, hiding under wagons, while a saloon sign creaked in the distance, counting down the seconds to the inevitable. Grayson wasn't some legend from a dime novel, just a man tired of other people's debts and blood, though he handled a revolver like he was born with it. Mason's was different, greedy as a coyote and just as low, robbing stagecoaches and leaving empty wallets and graves in his wake. Their feud started a year back when Grayson stopped Masons from stealing a widow's herd. Now, this noon, the town waited for the showdown, unaware the duel was just the opening act. The crowd stirred, whispering bets. Some backed Grayson for his aim, others Masons for his cunning. Old Joe, the storekeeper, muttered about seeing Masons drinking with the sheriff behind closed saloon doors last night. No one paid much mind. In San Diablo, rumors were cheaper than dust. But Grayson, standing in the sun, caught the sheriff's slight smirk like he knew something no one else did. If Mason shoots first, I'm a goner, Grayson thought, but his face stayed calm as a dry well. He wasn't one to rush, especially when a bullet spoke louder than words. The wind died and the silence grew so thick you could hear the creak of leather on Mason's belt. Everyone waited, but no one knew this day in San Diablo would be remembered for something other than gunfire. The silence on San Diablo's Main Street popped like a bubble on a red-hot skillet. From behind a barrel by the saloon, where stray cats usually hid, a man stumbled out. Hands bound, rope dangling from his wrists, but eyes blazing brighter than the noon sun. He was the hostage, a kid about 25 in a dirty shirt with a bruise on his cheek, held by Masons in an abandoned mine outside town. He staggered but stayed upright, yelling loud enough to hush the dogs. "The sheriff sold you all out like cattle to a slaughterhouse." The crowd gasped like someone spilled whiskey on the bar. Grayson, still as a statue, raised an eyebrow, his fingers hovering over his holster but in no rush. Mason's, on the other hand, twitched like he'd been stung, his smirk twisting into a grimace as if he'd swallowed a nail. Sheriff Collins, still chewing tobacco, straightened up from his post, but his hand drifted to his revolver, betraying the nerves he tried so hard to hide. The hostage, named Ben, didn't let up. Pointing at the sheriff, he shouted that Collins and Masons weren't enemies but partners, splitting stolen gold from stagecoaches and scheming behind the town's back. "I heard them in the mine," Ben roared, his voice shaking with anger. "They laughed about pinning it all on Grayson while they split the take." The crowd buzzed, someone cursed, and the seamstress dropped her basket, threads rolling into the dusty street. Grayson tilted his head, glancing at the sheriff, then Mason's. His face showed nothing but a faint smirk, like he'd just heard an old bar story. Inside, though, he was turning Ben's words over like a gambler shuffling cards before a big bet. If the kid was telling the truth, this duel was just a show, and the real game was just starting. Mason's clenched his fists, his eyes darting between Ben and the crowd, like he was picking who to shoot first. Ben, panting hard, kept going. "They knew about the gold in that stagecoach 3 weeks ago. The sheriff even gave Masons his men." That was too much. Old Joe in the crowd muttered he'd seen the sheriff ride out at night with 2 strangers. Women whispered, men exchanged looks, and the air grew heavy like before a storm. No one watched Grayson or Masons now. All eyes were on the sheriff, whose face looked like a poorly washed shirt. Ben's words hung over San Diablo like the smell of gunpowder after a shot. The hostage, still panting, jabbed a finger at Sheriff Collins, whose face now looked like cracked clay. He spilled how he'd overheard Collins and Masons in the mine splitting gold from a stagecoach robbed 3 weeks back, with the sheriff promising cover for a cut. The crowd, moments ago waiting for a duel, now stared at Collins like he'd stolen their last sip of water. Grayson stood still, but his eyes, squinted under his hat, slid from Ben to Collins. He saw the sheriff clench his jaw, trying to act like he didn't care. Masons, less restrained, spat into the dust and muttered something about a kid who needs to shut up. But Ben, tasting freedom, kept going. They met at the old creek, behind the hill, every Friday while the town slept. The crowd stirred like an anthill hit with a rock. Old Marge, who ran the boarding house, mumbled she'd seen the sheriff's horse by the creek the night the stagecoach vanished. Men exchanged glances, recalling how Collins always brushed off complaints about bandits, saying, "Not caught, not guilty." Now those words sounded like a mockery, and someone in the crowd clenched their fists, ready to lunge at the sheriff. Grayson shifted his weight, the creak of his boots louder than it should have been. He wasn't rushing to speak. Let Ben talk, he thought. Truth hits harder when it's aged like whiskey. But his faint smile said he was already planning his next move. Collins, feeling the crowd's eyes, tried to laugh it off. "This kid's delirious. Heat's got him." But his voice cracked and no one chuckled. Ben, wiping sweat from his brow, added that he'd heard the sheriff and Masons plotting to frame Grayson for the last robbery to distract the town. "They wanted you to kill him," he shouted, pointing at the cowboy. Grayson tilted his head like he was nodding at a good joke. But inside, he knew, if the crowd believed this, the duel would be the last thing San Diablo talked about. Ben's words rippled through San Diablo like stones tossed into still water. The crowd on Main Street buzzed like a swarm of riled-up bees, each person now recalling something off about Sheriff Collins. Old Marge, fidgeting with her dress hem, muttered she'd seen the sheriff ride back once with a sack too heavy for regular supplies. Hank, a farmer with calloused hands and a sun-reddened face, added that his neighbor had complained about missing grain sacks, and Collins had just shrugged it off. Grayson stood under the blazing sun, listening to the hum, not moving an inch. His fingers still rested near his holster, but he wasn't rushing. Let the crowd piece the puzzle together. He noticed Mason's clench his teeth, his eyes darting like he was looking for an escape. But the street was blocked by nosy onlookers. Sheriff Collins, trying to cling to his crumbling authority, adjusted his hat and growled, "You're buying this drifter's story? He'd sell his own ma for a shot of whiskey." But his words drowned in the crowd's whispers like a coin in a muddy river. Women by the store covered their mouths, murmuring how Collins always knew when a stagecoach carried something valuable. A blacksmith's apprentice shouted that his brother saw the sheriff's men poking around the abandoned mine where Ben was held. Every word, every glance in the crowd chipped away at Collins's reputation, and he felt it. His shoulders slumped slightly, his fingers fidgeting with his belt. Ben, still by the barrel, stared at the crowd with defiance, as if saying, "I told the truth, now it's your move." His voice steadied, and he added, "Ask the sheriff where he was when Masons hit that stagecoach last month." It was a fresh blow, and the crowd's buzz grew louder. Someone yelled, "Where's your money, Collins?" Others joined in, and the air filled with accusations, thick as dust before a storm. Grayson, watching the chaos, tipped his hat slightly to shade his eyes. He didn't care for crowds, too much noise, too little action. But he knew this hum wasn't just gossip. San Diablo was waking up, and someone would soon pay for all those nights the town slept, clueless to the truth. The crowd's rumble on San Diablo's main street swelled like a storm brewing, but Grayson stood still, a rock in the desert. His hand rested near his holster, fingers unmoving, as he listened to Ben's words tear into Sheriff Collins's reputation like an old canvas. The hostage, wiping blood from a split lip, shouted about how the sheriff and Masons split gold while the town starved, and Grayson caught not just anger in his voice, but fear that no one would listen. He knew this wasn't just about a duel anymore. It was about a truth San Diablo had ignored too long. The cowboy scanned the crowd slowly. Farmers clenched fists. Women whispered, and old Joe by the store was already guessing how much whiskey stolen gold could buy. Grayson saw Masons, pale as a dry well, try to catch the sheriff's eye, but Collins stared at the ground like he hoped to find his lost excuses there. Shooting now means missing the real game, Grayson thought, a faint smirk tugging at his lips, like a man who knows the cards are falling his way. Ben, breathless from his own fire, turned to Grayson and yelled, "You saw them, Cowboy, didn't you? Tell them I'm not lying." Grayson didn't answer, just tilted his head slightly as if saying, "Keep going, kid. You're doing fine without me." He wasn't one for talking when actions could speak, but every word from Ben confirmed the duel was a setup. Collins and Masons wanted Grayson as the scapegoat, and the town would have swallowed it like bad whiskey. The crowd now looked not just at the sheriff, but at Grayson, waiting for his move. He felt their stares, heavy as sacks of grain, but he didn't rush. Let them talk, he thought. Truth'll crawl out like a snake from a hole. His decision was simple. Don't shoot, don't speak. Just wait for Collins and Masons to bury themselves. His smile widened, but his eyes stayed cold as the steel of his revolver. Someone in the crowd shouted, "If it's true, where's the gold, Collins?" The sheriff flinched, his hand jerking toward his holster, but stopping halfway. Grayson noticed and thought patience was the best weapon in this game. San Diablo wasn't just watching anymore, the town was turning into a judge. The crowd's roar on San Diablo's main street sounded like a hungry beast, and Sheriff Collins knew staying silent was like standing under a falling rock. He cleared his throat, stepped forward, and raised his hands as if calming a spooked horse. "What? You believe this ragged drifter?" he started, nodding at Ben, whose shirt hung in tatters. "This guy was drinking for 3 days in that mine, till Masons tied him up." His voice boomed, but it cracked like a sun-baked board. The crowd hushed, not out of respect. More like a predator sniffing its prey. Old Marge muttered she'd never seen Ben drunk, and Hank, the farmer, grumbled that the sheriff himself had stumbled out of the saloon past midnight, more than once. Collins, feeling the ground slip away, switched tactics. "I've protected this town while you slept at night," he barked. "And this cowboy," he jabbed a finger at Grayson, "just stirs up trouble." Grayson, with that same lazy smirk, didn't budge. He knew Collins's words weren't defense, but panic, like a coyote caught in a trap. Masons, meanwhile, glared at the sheriff like he wanted to strangle him for dragging them both down. Ben, still by the barrel, sneered and shouted, "Protected? Then why were your men guarding me in that mine, Collins?" It hit like a whip, and the crowd buzzed again. Collins swallowed hard, his eyes darting like a cornered animal's. He stepped toward Ben, pointing. "One more word, and I'll lock you up, kid." But the threat rang hollow, like a shot fired into the air. Women in the crowd whispered, men exchanged looks, and even old Joe, usually quiet, muttered, "Time you locked yourself up, Sheriff." Grayson, watching the circus, gave a slight shake of his head like he was at a bad play. The crowd wasn't just listening now. It was judging. Every glance, every whisper added weight to Ben's words, and Collins felt it. His hand twitched toward his revolver again, but he froze, noticing Grayson's fingers edge closer to his holster. The cowboy said nothing, but his silence spoke louder than any threat. San Diablo was waiting, and the sheriff had to decide how far he'd go to save his own skin. The air on San Diablo's main street turned thick as tar, every glare from the crowd stinging Sheriff Collins like a red-hot needle. He stood, fists clenched, while Ben, the hostage, still by the barrel, jabbed a finger at him, repeating accusations of gold and conspiracy. But then Masons, his face paler than the dust underfoot, stepped forward and roared, "Enough, Collins! If I go down, you're sinking with me!" The crowd froze as if someone fired a shot in the air, and even the dogs whimpering under wagons fell silent. Masons, spitting into the dirt, started spilling his side, each word like a nail in the coffin of the sheriff's reputation. He told how Collins pitched the stagecoach robbery 3 weeks back, how they split the gold in the abandoned mine, and how the sheriff vowed to keep Grayson in the crosshairs to distract the town. "You said he was an easy mark," Masons growled, pointing at Collins, whose eyes darted like a trapped animal's. Grayson, still by the saloon, tipped his hat slightly, hiding a faint smirk. He didn't step in, but his gaze, cold and sharp as a blade, tracked Mason's every move. The cowboy knew the bandit wasn't turning noble. Mason's was just saving his own skin, hoping the crowd would turn on the sheriff. "Let them talk," Grayson thought. "Rats always fight when the ship's sinking." The crowd erupted in shouts. Hank, the farmer, bellowed, "Hang them both right now!" Women by the store whispered, counting how many times Collins left town. On business, old Joe, gripping his cane, muttered he'd always suspected the sheriff, but kept quiet because who wants a bullet for it? Ben, watching the chaos, grinned like a man who'd just won at poker with a bad hand. Collins, feeling the ground slip away, tried to speak, but his voice drowned in the crowd's roar. His hand twitched toward his revolver, but he froze, seeing Grayson's fingers edge closer to his holster. Masons kept going. "Ask him about the chest in his barn. That's where your gold is." It was the final blow, and the crowd, like a river breaching a dam, surged closer to the sheriff, demanding answers. The crowd on San Diablo's main street boiled like a pot over a fire, shouts about gold and betrayal echoing off the saloon's walls. Masons, having spilled everything about the sheriff's scheme, stood panting like he'd just slipped a noose. Collins, his face gray as ash, tried to mumble something, but his words drowned in the crowd's noise. Then Grayson, silent as a noon shadow till now, stepped forward and raised a hand, like he was halting a storm. His voice, low and steady, cut through the din like a knife through leather. I saw them at the creek behind the hill twice, with sacks that didn't smell of honest work. He spoke slowly, savoring each word, and the crowd hushed, hanging on every phrase. Grayson nodded at Collins and Masons. These two are like coyotes splitting the hall while the town sleeps. His smirk was sharp as a cactus spine, and the crowd snorted, as if hearing an old truth no one wanted to admit. Collins flinched like he'd been slapped and shouted, "You're lying, Grayson. You got no proof." But his voice shook, and even Hank, the farmer standing closest, shook his head as if saying, "Too late, Sheriff." Masons, realizing his bid to shift blame had failed, clenched his fists and shot Grayson a look full of venom. The cowboy just shrugged like he'd been offered warm beer in the heat. Grayson went on, voice still level. "I saw their horses by the mine where they kept Ben, and wagon tracks carrying something heavy." He paused, locking eyes with Collins. "Tell us, Sheriff, what's in your barn besides old Tack?" The crowd buzzed like a swarm of wasps, and someone yelled, "Check his barn." Women by the store whispered, and old Joe muttered he always knew Collins was too slick for an honest man. Ben, still by the barrel, looked at Grayson with something like respect, but also worry, as if afraid the cowboy was pushing too far. Grayson, done talking, stepped back, his hand resting near his holster again. He wasn't aiming to be a hero. He'd just tossed kindling on a fire already burning. Now, the crowd, not the duel, would decide who paid for the deceit. The crowd's roar on San Diablo's main street exploded like gunpowder in an old rifle as Grayson's words about the sheriff's barn hit the townsfolk's ears. Collins, his face now like crumpled tin, knew excuses wouldn't save him anymore. His hand jerked to his revolver, fingers trembling, but he managed to grip the handle. At the same moment, Masons, 10 paces away, reached for his own gun, his eyes burning with the fury of a cornered coyote. Grayson, his shadow stretching long across the dusty road, was faster. His revolver leapt from its holster like lightning, and a shot rang out, knocking the gun from Collins's hand. The sheriff's holster tore apart, the revolver landing in the dirt. Masons, barely getting his aim, took a bullet in the ground by his feet, dust kicking up like a curtain in a cheap theater. The crowd gasped, some stepping back, while old Marge covered her mouth with a handkerchief as if scared to breathe the gun smoke. Ben, by the barrel, stared at Grayson, mouth agape, hands still bound but grinning like a man who'd just seen his enemies fall into their own trap. "Hell of a shot, cowboy," he shouted, his voice almost cheerful despite the bruises on his face. Grayson, not answering, spun his revolver on his finger and holstered it like he'd just swatted a fly, not disarmed 2 armed men. Collins, clutching his bruised hand, glared at Grayson with hatred, but fear flickered in his eyes like a man who knew he'd lost. Masons, standing in a cloud of dust, spat and muttered, "You'll pay for this, cowboy," but his threat sounded weak, like a mutt's bark. The crowd, still buzzing, edged closer, and Hank, the farmer, shouted, "Now to the barn, let's check for that gold." Others joined in, the townsfolk's anger thick as the midday heat. Grayson stepped back, his face calm, but inside he knew the job wasn't done. He hadn't shot to kill, not today. But he saw the crowd turning into a jury and understood Collins and Masons were out of moves. His gaze flicked to Ben, a slight smile tugging at his lips as if saying, "Nice work, kid." The crowd's anger on San Diablo's main street felt as real as the gun smoke still lingering after Grayson's shots. Collins, clutching his bruised hand, stood surrounded by townsfolk whose glares cut sharper than knives. Masons, dust on his boots and weaponless, looked like a man who'd just lost his last coin at poker. The crowd, fired up by shouts about gold in the sheriff's barn, surged forward, and Hank's voice boomed over the noise. "Time to settle who's been robbing us blind." Women by the store demanded Collins and Masons be tied up and dragged to the barn, while old Joe, banging his cane, added he wanted to see the gold himself before "those rats scamper off." A young blacksmith's apprentice grabbed a rope from a wagon and stepped toward Masons, but Ben, still by the barrel, shouted, "Let them say a word before you string them up." His voice shook, but it carried a strange mix of anger and fairness. Collins, trying to salvage some dignity, straightened and rasped, "You can't judge me without proof. I'm your sheriff." But his words drowned in jeers and shouts, and someone chucked a clod of dirt, hitting his shoulder. Masons, seeing the crowd wasn't joking, raised his hands and muttered, "I just did what he told me." That sparked a fresh wave of outrage, and Hank roared, "You robbed stagecoaches, and now you whimper like a pup." Grayson, standing off by the saloon, watched the chaos, his hand resting near his holster, but staying out of it. He knew the crowd was its own law now, and his part was done. His gaze swept over the townsfolk, from furious Hank to old Marge, already figuring how the gold could fix the schoolhouse. He gave Ben a slight nod, like saying, "You got them riled, now hold on." Then he turned and walked slowly toward the saloon, leaving the crowd to decide the fate of two traitors. The noise behind him grew. Shouts, arguments, the sound of footsteps heading to the sheriff's barn. Some called to burn it if the gold wasn't there. Others demanded a trial right on the street. Grayson didn't look back. He knew San Diablo would sort out what to do with those who'd betrayed it. Dust settled on his boots, and the smell of gun smoke still hung in the air. Dust on San Diablo's main street still settled as the crowd, buzzing like a kicked hive, marched toward the sheriff's barn, demanding gold and justice. Grayson, his boots leaving faint tracks in the dirt, walked to the saloon without glancing at the shouts and stomping behind him. His hat shaded his eyes, but the corners of his mouth twitched when he heard Hank yell, "If there's no gold, we'll burn it all down." The cowboy knew his job was done, and the town would handle its rats from here. Stepping into the saloon, Grayson nodded at the barman, old Ted, whose face was wrinkled as a sun-dried lemon. "Whiskey, no fuss," he said, settling at the counter where the air smelled of cheap tobacco and spilled beer. Ted, wiping a glass, grumbled, "You stirred up a mess, cowboy. They'll tear everything apart out there." Grayson just shrugged, his fingers wrapping around the glass like an old friend, taking a sip as the burn in his throat drowned out the noise outside. Through the saloon's cloudy window, he saw the crowd, waving arms, dragging Collins and Masons toward the barn. Old Marge, hobbling with her cane, shouted about the schoolhouse, while the young blacksmith's apprentice waved a rope like he'd already picked a tree for hanging. Grayson didn't interfere. He wasn't a judge, and had no interest in being one. His job was to give the truth a shot, and now San Diablo would decide who lived or didn't. Ben, still with ropes on his wrists, pushed through the crowd and stepped into the saloon, his face dusty, but eyes alight. "You took them down, Grayson," he said, sitting beside him. The cowboy glanced over, gave a slight smirk, and replied, "Not me, kid. You lit that fire." He raised his glass in a quiet salute, adding, "Well, they'll have something to remember now." Outside, the shouts grew louder, but Grayson sipped slowly, as if time in the saloon ran by its own rules. The saloon in San Diablo was quiet as a midnight well, despite the shouts and stomping from the street where the crowd dragged Collins and Masons to the barn. Grayson sat at the counter, sipping whiskey slowly, his fingers tapping the glass like he was counting down to the next act of this dusty drama. Ben settled beside him, rubbed his wrists, still red from the ropes, and looked at the cowboy like he'd just outsmarted the devil. Outside, shadows of townsfolk flickered, and the smell of gun smoke mixed with dust kicked up by dozens of boots. Ted, the barman, wiping the counter, tossed out, "They'll find that gold or hang both of them, Grayson." "Did you know it had come to this?" The cowboy just grunted, his eyes sliding to the cloudy window where torchlight reflected from the crowd heading to the barn. "I knew the truth hits heavy as a bullet," he said, his voice calm as a desert before dawn. Ben, sipping water Ted poured without asking, chuckled and said, "You took them down without one extra shot." Suddenly, a crash echoed outside. Someone kicked in the barn door, and the crowd's shouts sharpened like dogs catching a scent. Grayson didn't turn his head, but his lips twitched in a faint smile, as if he already knew what they'd find. Ben, unable to hold back, asked, "Think the gold's there?" The cowboy shrugged and replied, "If it ain't, they'll find something else to get mad about." His words hung in the air like smoke from a freshly fired revolver. New shouts came from outside. Someone yelled about a chest, another about a rope. Old Marge's voice, cutting through even the saloon walls, demanded the gold go to the schoolhouse. Grayson finished his whiskey, set the glass on the counter, and looked at Ben. "That's how it went," he said, and they both laughed quietly like they shared an old joke. The cowboy nodded to Ted, tossed a coin on the counter, and stood, his boots thumping on the wooden floor. Leaving the saloon, Grayson paused at the door, gazing at the dusty street where torches lit up the townsfolk's angry faces. He knew San Diablo would never be the same, but that didn't bother him. He'd done what he could, and the road was calling. Ben, watching him go, raised his water glass in a quiet salute and muttered, "See ya, cowboy."